Every nation in creation has its favorite drink. France is famous for its wine, its beer in Germany. Turkey has its coffee, and they serve it blacker than ink. Russians go for vodka, and England loves its tea.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 2 of Tea and Toast with me, Lewis Burnell, and my good friend David Pinner. In this week's episode, we wanted to have a chat about 22 Cans designer Peter Molyneux. If you haven't heard this week, he's been in the news a fair bit after a pretty damning interview with Rock Paper Shotgun, and after Eurogamer wrote a very interesting article on Curiosity winner Brian Henderson. For anyone who doesn't know, Peter Molyneux is the brainchild behind games such as Dungeon Keeper, Populous, Black and White, and Fable. He's also made a couple of recent indie games. Curiosity, which was an experimental product by his new development studio 22 Cans. In it, millions of players attempted to blast away at the surface of a cube to reveal what was inside. One lucky winner who reached the centre of the cube was supposed to receive a life-changing prize. His next adventure after Curiosity was a Kickstarter project called Godus. Pitched as a god game, 22 Cans were after £450,000 of people's money to complete the game in around 7 to 9 months without the aid of a publisher. 3 years later, it still isn't finished on the PC, a whole host of features are missing, and according to reports, there's no money left. If that wasn't bad enough, resources have supposedly been diverted away from Godus and onto a new project. Unsurprisingly, him and his studio have had a rough time of it the past few days, and Rock Paper Shotgun's interview in particular was blunt and brought Molyneux up on charges I've never really heard an interviewer ask before. When your first question in an interview is, "Are you a pathological liar?" you know it's not going to end very well. History lesson out of the way, today's Tea and Toast episode is a sort of for and against Peter Molyneux. He's famed for delivering games that are late, bigging them up, and generally disappointing everyone in the process. I'm certainly no fan of his, though I loved his earlier works. David, on the other hand, is secretly in love with him. So, David, just to start us off, and for you to have your say first, why do you support Peter Molyneux's brand of lying to sell and promote video games?
I don't specifically support his brand of lying to support video games, Lewis. I just think that he's a good game developer, and just because he's a game developer doesn't necessarily mean people should just listen to everything he has to say about a game. I mean, if you look at his history, he's made a lot of good games.
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely made good games, and we ran through a couple of those earlier, so Black and White series, Dungeon Keeper Populous, he's done Fable, amongst many, many others. Do you think, though, in recent years that he's simply been relying on that reputation, and as a result he's sort of bigging up every single game that he develops in order to guarantee either income or sales? Certainly with his latest Kickstarter project and with the Rock Paper Shotgun interview, it was pretty clear that he over-egged the entire thing.
Well, he's over-exaggerated the entire thing since Fusion. I mean, if you read the old PC Gamer, EGM, Game Pro magazines, they were all about Molyneux's like, oh my god, this game's amazing. Even back with Dungeon Keeper and Theme Park, like, Theme Park was supposed to be the world's most realistic theme park simulator, 10 billion times better than Roller Coaster Tycoon, but it was essentially its own kind of campy game in of itself. Uh, I don't specifically think there's been a game that guy's ever made where he didn't hype it to the furthest points of the universe.
I think for me, he's just one big running joke at the minute, and I think anyone that actually gets behind him and says, "Do you know what he's doing is absolutely fine," I think is so wrong, because inevitably, and certainly with Godus, he's actually taken nearly £500,000 worth of people's money. But even before then, like, people buy into what he's saying, and a lot of the sales surrounding things like Fable and such were probably only as a result of what he promised, and when the games actually arrived, they were either buggy, broken, or it was evident that he just bullshitted his way through the entire thing.
The hard thing for me about this is that, like, I know you have this opinion that, like, Fable sucked, but if you discarded what Molyneux was saying in all the magazines at the time, or, internet print, which was sort of 2004, the internet wasn't as, like, awesome as it was now, but I mean, like, Fable's a great game. Fable got great reviews. People love the game. Sure, his, like, hype engine that he did might have accounted for a lot of day one sales, but just because some dude wrote in a magazine that his game's awesome doesn't necessarily drive people to buy the game. I mean, I think that Peter's a great developer in most of the games he's made, including even the movies, which still has a large fan community behind it, were great. It's just that my thing is I don't understand why people gave him money directly, understanding that ever since his Bullfrog days, he's a BS artist.
I think what I find odd about all of it is that whenever he is developing a game, he builds it up into something so wondrous that obviously people get caught up in the hype. But what frustrates me about the entire situation is the fact that there are other developers out there, indie developers and big AAA developers, producing games that are better than what he and his studios have created in the last 6 or 7 years. They get half of the amount of coverage, and yet he fails to deliver time and time again, and he's still entertaining interviews. And I think the Eurogamer coverage recently regarding the fact that 22 Cans pretty much abandoned the winner of Curiosity and Rock Paper Shotgun, knocking him down a peg or two, has probably knocked him in his studio for 6, because he's never had that sort of feedback from anyone. Most journalists have simply sort of pandered to him, and it was sort of like a running joke behind his back about the fact that he lied constantly.
I don't specifically the thing about the rock paper shotgun thing. I think it's kind of. I mean, people have called him out before, and I mean every internet forum from here to New Mexico has essentially said the guy's crazy with all of his things, especially after Fable, when Fable was supposed to be this giant world where decisions were so important when it was actually just a really fun action adventure game. Um, I specifically think the problem is that Peter's a great developer, but he's not a great businessman. And I would buy any game that he developed, but I don't think I would buy any game that he ran the studio for. Specifically because he does have this large history of over exaggerating games. A good example of, but I mean, it's sort of like a thing with simulation games, though. Even Will Wright has overhyped his games before, and sort of that was like the last part of his career, right? The founder of Maxis, the SimCity, the Sims Lord, Will Wright, overhyped Spore. After Spore was launched, and it was essentially like completely nothing similar to what he had hyped. He rode off into the sunset. I think that people listening to developers is a more important thing to think about than specifically just Peter Molyneux, because a developer goes and I mean a lot of developers I've seen takes their whiteboard from the morning idea brainstorming session, go to the media and say, "Oh, look at all these cool features our game's gonna have," even before the programmers have taken even a single programming cycle on it.
Yeah, I think the industry is definitely guilty in a lot of ways. I mean, I think back to when Guild Wars 2 was on the marketing push, and they constantly hyped, well, ArenaNet constantly hyped up about the fact that dynamic events were these continuous chain that would have permanent impacts on the world, that a group of centaurs would wipe out a village and control it from then forth until you actually take control back, and inevitably it was just a timed event that had an end and it had a beginning and it just looped on a repeat, and it really was just bullshit throughout the entire thing. And I think every single developer to some degree is guilty of it, because obviously marketing teams want them to push their game onto those that are going to buy it. But I think out of everyone, Peter Molyneux certainly holds the crown as someone more guilty than most.
I definitely agree he's not doing the industry any favors. That's for sure. And he hasn't done the fans of Godus any favors as well. But it's another example of I think the lesson here isn't specifically just Peter Molyneux. I think the lesson here is that developers aren't specifically the people to best express a game. Because what is a developer? It's the dude that says, it's the idea, man. These are the ideas. Okay? This is the direction the ship's going. I'm the ship's captain. It's the producer and the programmers that actually work on actually making actual game. The developers just sits there and, brainstorms and conceptualizes everything.
Mm. I mean, it's not really very surprising that some companies, say like ArenaNet again, have reached the point where PR disaster after PR disaster just results in them going completely introverted, where they say nothing unless it's in a really controlled environment. And despite all the slip-ups, Peter has never really grasped that, and he's continued to pander to the media's affection, when actually he really should just be keeping his mouth shut. I think as another thing as well out of all of this is the fact that Kickstarter is a problem in itself, and although it's doing some really good things for the gaming industry, I really think it needs tightening up. I think there needs to be greater accountability. I think rather than just promises, it needs to be backed up with data, such as how many staff you've got, what salaries they're on, timeline for expenditure. All of that needs to be presented before a Kickstarter can actually begin.
Oh, well, Kickstarter is an entirely different thing. My belief of Kickstarter is that Kickstarter is for people that want to sell books or rent venues or make a product, and they have a fixed cost per unit that they know, if I get this many people or this many units, this is the cost. If you give me this much money, I can start production now. Kickstarter's, I believe, is fully for coming up with the cash to go give the manufacturer the down payment to start production on a product and ship it. I don't think it's for video games. Like, you can't decide how much a video game is going to cost. Star Citizen asked for what, like $1 million, $1.5 million, 500,000. I don't have it up with me right now, but and now they're aiming for $100 million. He needs $100 million to finish the game. So I mean, you don't know how much a video game is going to cost. Peter Molyneux doesn't know how much a video game was going to cost. And if he did, he's an idiot. I don't know. I just don't think that video games is a great medium for crowdfunding to be the sole source of what funds the game.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the nature of game development is super fluid anyway, and Kickstarter really doesn't lend itself to that, because the stretch goals alone, they make an entire project unrealistic. To use Star Citizen, I think they actually originally asked for sort of 2 to 5 million, but the original Kickstarter was around 2 million, and then they needed more on their official website. But when stretch goals get added and added and added, the pressure of development just becomes even greater, but they're incentivized to add stretch goals because it guarantees that they will hit their target. So I think it's like a vicious circle on Kickstarter, and I do feel for Peter Molyneux in that way. But I think with this experience in the industry, he should have known that when Godus was being planned. I think the original time frame was nonsense. I thought the original amount he was asking for was nonsense. So I think he's only really got himself to blame. There's a quote here in The Guardian. I suppose that'll round it up for this week's episode of Tea and Toast, but he states that it's officially over. I will not speak to the press again. Do you think he will stand by that?
He already hasn't. Like, he said that to Rock Paper Shotgun, then he went and interviewed with The Guardian, then he went and interviewed with someone else. I don't know. It seems like he's having a temper tantrum right now because people are calling him out. But again, for Godus, I mean, specifically, I think the issue here was Molyneux should have developed it, but someone else should have ran the project. And I think the reason Molyneux is so in the spotlight is that he has ran every studio he has made a game for. He founded Bullfrog, and he ran it until it got acquired by, I believe it was, EA?
Yeah.
And then he got tired of having a publisher, so he went and made Lionhead Studios, which, again, sold out to Microsoft. He got tired of having a publisher, and he said, well, I'll just make 22 kids. And, it's a thing where he has an ego, and he doesn't, I guess, want to work for anyone. and have anyone tell him what to do, but he's someone that needs that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that's the problem here, is that Molyneux is a developer that is essentially just like Derek Smart. He's hype. He has to be the hype man for his game. He's the head of his studio, and no one can tell him, go sit in the room and be quiet and let us talk.
So I think that's a good place to end on for this week's Tea and Toast video podcast. For those of you watching, what are your thoughts on Peter Molyneux? Please do let us know in the comments below, and if you've enjoyed what you've heard, hit the like and subscribe button. We'll see you next week.
Every nation in creation has its favorite drink. France is famous for its wine, its beer in Germany. Turkey has its coffee, and they serve it blacker than ink. Russians go for vodka, and England loves its tea.